Felipe Franks, you are an Atlanta Falcon. Hi, my name's Joe Patrick, covering the Atlanta Falcons for 92.9 The Game. Welcome back to another episode of Joe Patrick on football. And today we've finally been waiting for that kind of signals the start of the new season, which is the roster cutdown day. The 53-man roster for the Falcons is officially been unveiled, or maybe it's not a 53-man roster. It's actually a 52-man roster for the Falcons because they did go ahead and make a move today to they made a small trade to add some tackle depth, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But without further ado, let's just jump right into the roster. We're going to go through it, the players that were kept, and I'll just give you some of my reaction to it, because you probably at this point have heard at least some of the players, the main players who have made the team and not made the team, if you're paying attention. So let's start with the roster. Only two quarterbacks. So right off the bat, first miss from me and my predictions. I had Easton Stick making the roster. Of course, the Falcons decided to keep that roster spot open to keep some other players, and so they only keep Michael Penix and Kirk Cousins. My rationale for keeping Easton Stick was always just a matter of the fact that Kirk Cousins could go at any point, and therefore you would want somebody who is kind of knows what they're doing in this offense, because it is a complex offense that Zach Robinson has schemed up here. But I think what this shows is that there's just no interest in Kirk Cousins at this point in time from the rest of the NFL. There's no, injuries that have happened to quarterbacks around the league. Again, I knew this, of course, but I kind of figured that the Falcons would want to make sure they had Easton Stick on the roster, like in case there was an injury for week one. But they'll get Easton Stick back on the practice squad. I'm sure. They feel confident in being able to do that. And so they only have to keep the two quarterbacks. So moving on to running back, where they did keep three running backs, as we were predicting: Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, and Nathan Carter. Nate Carter makes this roster kind of from out of nowhere, frankly, a UDFA who showed his burst in the preseason with that long touchdown run. And at that point, we put him on our roster. And ever since, I think we kind of wavered in the final prediction show. I don't know if I even kind of said firmly who it was going to be, because I thought Carlos Washington Jr., if he was healthy, was going to make it. Turns out he was healthy. I mean, he wasn't like an IR designation, obviously, but maybe not healthy enough where they ultimately did release him and or put him on waivers and put Nate Carter on the roster. So I'll give us half credit maybe for that one. I don't want to give us too much credit here. Wide receiver, they do keep 7 wide receivers, and maybe this is one of the reasons why they only kept the 2 quarterbacks, is because they did go kind of extra here at wide receiver with Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod, Kadero Hodge, and Casey Washington. Those are the 5 that we all kind of had nailed down, especially Casey Washington really, firmly solidifying himself about halfway through training camp. And then the team also keeps David Sills on the roster, which we've been calling for a while. So I think that's one we can give ourselves credit for, where it was maybe not purely unanimous amongst a lot of the media. And Jamal Agnew, which we then take that credit right away from us, because we've basically been predicting Jamal Agnew as kind of a surprise cut. But he does ultimately make the team. He will be the team's kick returner. And there's that. So, basically right here, you got 7 receivers, but one of them, it's really 6 in my opinion, with Jamal Agnew just kind of being an outlier as a return specialist. You got Drake London, and David Sills will basically be his backup at the Z position. Darnell Mooney is the X, with Casey Washington as his backup, and we'll find out more information when we talk to Raheem Morris, or when Raheem Morris speaks later this week, potentially early next week, about the status of Darnell Mooney heading into week 1 against Tampa Bay. And then Ray McLeod, who, as we noted, left practice again when Caleb McGarry was hurt, and is now out for the year officially, having been put on IR with this roster release. And Kadero Hodge, I think, kind of being the backup for him. So there's your 7 receivers. Moving on to tight end, 4 tight ends being kept by the Falcons. We'd only been predicting 3, but Felipe Franks, as we said off the top, always seems to find a way onto the Falcons roster. And it's well earned, I got to say. I know some fans will kind of roll their eyes. It's kind of becoming a joke, which is one of the reasons I did mention it at the top. But you got to give him credit. I mean, the guy, he really made plays down the stretch of training camp. And obviously, I think the coaching staff and a lot of people know what he is on special teams, how useful he is in so many different areas. So, well deserved for Felipe Franks to make the roster. Kyle Pitts, Charlie Warner, and Tegan Cotoriano, of course, are the other 3 that make the roster. Now let's get into the offensive line where things get interesting here because Caleb McGarry, as I mentioned just a second ago, is out for the season. He will not return. It looked briefly for a few minutes there like he was potentially going to be on that IR was the designation to return, as we put in our roster prediction, our roster prediction, our latest one. We, of course, didn't really know the status of him at that point. So he is going to be out for the year, which, it opens up a place on the roster. I guess you can at least say that. But ultimately, that's obviously going to be a tough gap. And I think that's something the Falcons are going to be continuing to look to fill. And they did that in part today by trading for a Seahawks tackle. He was a 7th-round pick in 2027, Michael Jarrell. The Falcons actually played against him last season. He did not do particularly well against the Falcons, but the Falcons didn't have much of a pass rush either. So I think ultimately that Jarrell is depth for this offensive line. I think that ultimately the starting right tackle is either going to be Elijah Wilkinson, probably the most likely, or I believe that there will be very likely a waiver claimed by the Falcons for a right tackle of all the releases that happened today. And I believe that will ultimately bump Jack Nelson, who does make this roster, to the practice squad. But for now, let's go through the names. Jake Matthews, Matthew Bergeron, Ryan Nuzul, Chris Lindstrom, and Elijah Wilkinson kind of slotted in the list, at least, as that right tackle. So there's your starting 5 at this point. And then the 3 reserve linemen are Jack Nelson at this point in time, Jovan Gwynn, and Kyle Hinton. So again, not a lot of change in this reserve offensive line room from what it's been for a while, with Jovan Gwynn kind of still holding down that reserve backup center role, and Kyle Hinton as your swing guard, basically. And, I have my reservations about those players, and those reservations I think were maybe, bore out in the preseason with the lack of push and the lack of ability to create holes in the run game that this backup offensive line was able to do. But ultimately, congratulations to those players for making the roster at this point in time. Another surprising move on the defensive line as we move to the defensive side of the football. Only 5 defensive linemen being kept here by the Falcons, and they did go heavier in the secondary. We'll talk about that in a second. But the 5 defensive linemen kept right now are David Onyemata, Brandon Dorlus, Ruka Rororo, Zach Harrison. All, those are the 4 names we expected. And then LaCale London makes this roster, and I thought he was a bubble player with the Falcons keeping 6 defensive linemen, or potentially even 7. But ultimately he was a player who was cut last year, stayed on the Falcons, got back on their practice squad, stayed on the Falcons practice squad all year long, and makes the team out of camp this year. So I do think that he's ultimately another one of those bubble players who could see himself bumped down to the practice squad over time, because one of the notes of this roster release was that Taquan Graham, who was not listed, you'll notice in that list, he is on the IR with a designation to return. So he's going to miss the first 4 games at least of the season, but he will be designated to return. I do think that the team will ultimately rely on him once he is healthy, and I think that could rearrange things a bit for the back end of this room. But for now, LaCale London makes the team on top of those 4 other guys that we mentioned. And LaCale London, it makes sense that it's him over some of these other names, just because he is the biggest bodied. He is the best option the team has as a true nose. And so I think that he will be kind of a specialist in that sense. I think he'll just be the nose tackle when they do need to do some base sets or even like goal line looks, just to give some beef there in the A gaps. At edge rusher, the team did ultimately keep 6 edge rushers, but not the 6 maybe that we had been predicting for a while, because we had the obvious names plus Khalid Kareem. Khalid Kareem was waived, or I'm just interchanging the words cut and released and waived. There are actually differences between these. Khalid Kareem was a release. Don't ask me to actually tell you the differences or why. I believe it has something to do with their NFL experience and things like that, and how it relates to their free agent status, or waiver status, whatever it might be. But anyway, 6 edge rushers: Arnold Ebiketie, Leonard Floyd, Jalen Walker, James Pierce, and Braylon Trice, who we all figured it would be, and then D'Angelo Malone as that 6th edge rusher. Again, kind of similar to Felipe Franks. Probably won't see the field a whole lot on defense in that position, but certainly Raheem Morris has spoken about it before. They think of him as their kind of special teams ace, and he will continue to have one of those jobs on punt team where he can run down the field and tackle in space. So they'll be relying on him to do more of that this year. Moving on to inside linebacker, the team has kept 4. And again, there is some news to report here in the inside linebacker room, and it's as expected. Troy Anderson listed as the on pup. He remains on the pup list, and he will have a designation to return, but that essentially puts him in the same spot as Taquan Graham and Storm Norton, who I skipped over, but we obviously know that story of players who will miss the first 4 games of the season. So Troy Anderson will, I believe, come back at some point, but it won't be before the first 4 games, really before the bye. So before the bye, the team will roll with Caden Ellis and Divine Diablo as their starting linebackers. J.D. Bertrand does make the team. He did not have a good preseason, looked kind of underwhelming, slow, not a big hitter, obviously, but we talked a little bit about him in a previous episode. He does make the team, and Josh Woods also makes the team, who we pretty much nailed this room. Pretty easy one to predict, I gotta say, especially with what was going on with Troy Anderson. If he was healthy, it would be a little bit more interesting to see who they would maybe keep between Woods and J.D. Bertrand, to be honest. But those are your 4 linebackers. And then at cornerback, they do keep 7 corners, including Billy Bowman, who they have listed as a corner now. It's AJ Terrell, Mike Hughes, Billy Bowman. Clark Phillips makes the team. Maybe a big surprise, basically, at this point, considering he really has not played much in training camp and was, I figured, on the outs for that reason. But he does make the team. Of course, does have that kind of equity of having been, a recent draft pick. So that helps him there. D. Alford makes the team. Mike Ford does make the team. Again, similar to D'Angelo Malone, similar to Jamal Agnew, one of these special teams aces who we don't really expect to be playing defense all that much, but he is in this cornerback room. And then Natron Brooks makes the team. So he was a notable cut. We listed him in previous episodes when we've done our roster projections, kind of showing some of the notable cuts that happened last year. Natron Brooks was one of them. But congratulations to him. Like LaCale London makes the team this year, and well-deserved. The guy is just a bullet around on the field. He will fly around, throw his body in harm's way, and just generally makes plays. And through keeping 7 corners, interestingly enough, they only keep 3 safeties. Jordan Fuller, a surprising release from this group where we thought it was kind of nailed down that there was going to be, the 4 safeties, including him. But ultimately, it's only the 3 with Jesse Bates, Xavier Watts, and DeMarco Helms. And I think when you look at those 3 names, I think that you can kind of presume at this point that Xavier Watts not only won the job over Fuller, but is going to be the starting safety for the Falcons in week 1. And if we include Billy Bowman in this, I think it's maybe notable that Billy Bowman is listed 3rd amongst the quarterback list, and it's not alphabetically done or anything like that. So, I think that there's every reason to believe that Billy Bowman has won the job as the starting nickel for this team coming out of camp, and Xavier Watts as the starting safety. And it reminds me of what Raheem Morris said way back when. I can't remember exactly when it was. I believe it was at some point during OTAs and before training camp even began, saying that there was going to be a real intention to play these rookie players. So that's certainly bearing true with this roster release. And the specialists are, no surprise, Younghoe Koo, Bradley Pinion, and long snapper Liam McCullough wraps it up. So that's the list of names. Just to go through some of the notable releases. In fact, I'm not going to run through every single name, but I know I put out a tweet that had some the notable cuts. Again, Jordan Fuller, Khalid Kareem, CJ Henderson, the cornerback, was released. There is a report saying that the Falcons are looking to get him back. Not surprised by that, because I thought, frankly, he would make the team just based on kind of the, again, you don't want to say lack of depth. There are 7 players there, but again, Clark Phillips is a surprise for me. I just thought that they would want a different player profile. It's a small cornerback room, just like physically short kings in that room, and CJ Henderson has a little bit more length to him, and I thought that would be a reason for keeping him. But ultimately, he does get released, and hopefully we'll be back on the practice squad and for the Falcons. Kentavious Street, also a surprising maybe release, and Chris Blair also waived. He was one of the notable ones that we've been highlighting as a player who was waived at the same exact point last year, on cut day, and ultimately dressing and playing in the game in week 1. So that could still be the case for, I think, Jordan Fuller, Khalid Kareem. I think those two in particular, potentially even Chris Blair, depends on what the health situation is of guys like Darnell Mooney and Ray McLeod. But there could be even more. There were 2 players last year, it was Chris Blair and Kevin King, who were cut on cut day and ultimately did play in that week 1 game. And I think you could have even more than that this year. So even some of these releases, don't think that they're just gone forever. Will likely play a role for the Falcons this season, at least some of them. And then I did want to list out some players I think the Falcons will be targeting to keep on the practice squad. And some of these will be repeat names: Jordan Fuller, Khalid Kareem, CJ Henderson, Kobe Bryant, the very popular UDFA does get released, but there's been, already chatter about him potentially getting re-signed if he doesn't get snapped up as a waiver claim. I don't think he will, though. I mean, I think the tendency for fans is to overrate, how the likelihood that you're going to lose players that you cut. But ultimately, around the league, they want players who have been in their program, who know their schemes, and they feel more comfortable with those guys. They're going to naturally tend to feel more comfortable with them versus just outside players who they don't know as well, who are going to need to, download all the information into their brains and such. So anyway, I do believe Kobe Bryant is probably likely to stick on the practice squad. Carlos Washington Jr., very similar reports, along with Easton Stick, that these are players who, the Falcons want back, and I'm sure that those players will be back, Easton Stick and Carlos Washington. Joshua Gray is one I think the Falcons are definitely going to want to keep around, another one of the UDFAs who's got some potential ability to play at center down the road. I think that's where they'll want to train him. And these young offensive linemen, it's not even just a Falcons thing. Something that Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot talked about, a couple of years ago, and I was asking them in press conferences. But these offensive linemen nowadays, they're just not as prepared for the NFL game than as they used to be coming out of college. I think part of that's down to, I think most of it's down to just like the schemes that are being run in college. So much RPO, so much quick game stuff. They're just not quite used, especially in the pass protection game, to protecting like they have to against, these very, very high caliber players that they will have not been competing against, many of them in the college ranks. So Joshua Gray and Jack Nelson. Jack Nelson's obviously a guy who's on the 53-man roster right now, but I do think that ultimately the Falcons will make a waiver claim for a right tackle that will compete with Elijah Wilkinson for that role. And then you all obviously have Jarrell, who we talked about, who will kind of also be some depth at the tackle position, because Elijah Wilkinson's not even a tackle necessarily. So ultimately, I think that way that will shake out will be with Jack Nelson ultimately hitting the practice squad. And I think that would be the right move for them. On the defensive line, I think Simeon Barrow Jr., he had a really nice training camp. I know the PFF grades, which are controversial, especially in preseason, as like how accurate they are, but he was, by PFF's metrics, had the second highest win rate of rookie, I believe, rookie rushers, rookie interior defense linemen. I don't believe it was all interior defense linemen. I think it was just rookies. But he had a really good preseason. Simeon Barrow did as well as he could have done. And I think that they will look to keep him on the practice squad. Probably Contavious Street as well. That one will probably come down to more whether Street wants to be here or elsewhere. But I would think that he would, probably want to be here. He's been here now for a little bit. His personal life is kind of set up here at this point. So wouldn't be surprised to see Contavious Street back as well. Chris Blair, Nick Nash, a couple wide receivers I would expect to be back. And there could be more too. This isn't a full list of players who I think will be back. I think those are just some names that will in particular be targeted. And Lenny Craig, obviously. Krieg, sorry, I've been saying it wrong. I always say Craig. I was told by a German, it's Krieg. Lenny Krieg. That's how we say it in America. He will be an IPP player, which basically means that once the Falcons are able to get him back, as long as he clears waivers and doesn't get claimed, the Falcons will put him on their, ostensibly the practice squad, although he cannot be claimed. He doesn't count against the practice squad. So a free player for the Falcons during the season. That would be great kind of backup for them in case Younghoe Koo does suffer an injury or, Lord forbid, some, thoracic downturn in form and all that stuff. So that's about it today. I didn't want to be too long with this because there's not a whole lot else to really analyze. We've talked about a lot of these guys previously, but there will definitely also be more transactions that come later this week. So we'll get caught up on that again later on. Tomorrow, we've got a really good show with John Fricky, one of our personalities here at 92.9 The Game, where I just chat with him about, what to expect this season, what our hopes and dreams are for the Falcons, potential pitfalls. We talk about the media, which is, of course, is has a stick up both of our butts, I think. So it's a fun show, obviously, with John Frecky. Whenever he joins, he's always got his opinions, and great to hear him out. And we'll be back with you with like a more newsy show probably on Thursday after we do get some more transactions in and we can get a better look at how this Falcons roster is shaping up ahead of week 1 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. It's almost here, guys. Like, we got 10 days or a week and a half basically until that game. I'm calling it a week and a half. So football is almost here. It's like right on the tips of our fingertips. It's really, really close, and I know we're all getting excited for that. So until we see you guys again, thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time.